China is waging a total war without rules against the United States, using unrestricted warfare to win by all means necessary.
And they trot out these numbers of only, 4,600 or so people that have died due to the coronavirus. Of course, they stopped counting of it in April of 2020.
To beat the United States in all aspects we don't consider to be battlefields. And their goal?
What they wanted the world to believe is that the Chinese model, the Chinese social, political, and economic model is superior to the democratic model.
Today, I speak with General Robert Spalding, retired Air Force Brigadier General, on his new book, War Without Rules, to understand what China's limitless warfare tactic, called unrestricted warfare, means. How China understands war differently than the West, what areas we're losing in, and what to do to combat the China threat. Well, General Robert Spalding, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
General, you talked about the thesis of unrestricted warfare being that the battlefield is everywhere. How does this change the way the Chinese military view what is the mindset of a war?
Well, I think you have to understand from their perspective and understand that the People's Liberation Army is the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. And so I think in the West, we consider the military to be a protector of the state, which in a democracy includes the people. And I think in China's case, the People's Liberation Army is actually a party army. So it protects the party's prerogatives. And moreover, being in the armed wing of the party, of the Chinese Communist Party, it really evolved in this platform of political warfare. And so the Chinese Communist Party, in defeating the Nationalist Party for control over the mainland China, it really did that through political means. So Mao Zedong really organized politically the country around, eroding the faith and confidence of the people in the Nationalist Party. And that's how they're able to win. And so what these two colonels identified was political warfare could go global if you embrace these two new tools, the internet and globalization. And that's what they lay out. They lay out a doctrine for how you make political warfare a global phenomenon, much like the United States used, its logistics, its expertise in aircraft and long range refueling and global supply chains to really advance that in a more of a military sense. China uses the tools of information and finance to advance political warfare on a global scale.
Of course, the idea of the book is to get people to comprehend what exactly is the scale of China's unrestricted warfare. I'm just curious, when you speak about truly understanding the enemy and understanding China, what exactly are the main factors to doing so?
Well, you have to understand that it's a completely different model in China where, I think from our standpoint, we use military force to achieve a political outcome. And, I often use the Kosovo War as a good example because in that war, we used air power to force the elites of Serbia to stop going after the Kosovars by essentially giving up Milosevic. And he eventually stood trial at The Hague for war crimes. In the same manner, China seeks to achieve political outcomes, but they do so using financial and economic relationships and the internet to slowly erode support or, to erode any popular support within a free society for opposing its interests. So, as the two PLA colonels write, using all means necessary to include unarmed force and armed force to compel your enemy to accept your interests. In other words, rather than using B-2s dropping bombs to take away the assets of the elites, we're going to use our economic capability and our, subterfuge, our breaking of the rules, the global international rules, to slowly create the same kind of outcomes, but without using the military force to do it. So you can take property away from an elite in the West, particularly if they, for example, invested, hundreds of billions of dollars or tens of billions or even $1 million in China by taking away that asset. Now you can say, if you can take away that asset because you have that money invested, you can say, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to take away this asset. So rather than now sending over airplanes to use force to achieve that outcome, you can achieve that outcome just through this relationship that's enabled by the internet and globalization.
What is the understanding of war in the West when it comes to achieving that objective? I assume it's very much different than what the colonels understand here.
Well, yeah, it's not only different in terms of just the concept, right? Because in the West, it's like you have periods of peace, then you have some kind of issue that comes up, you try to resolve it, you can't resolve it, then you use war to resolve it. That's kind of the classic Western definition. In terms of the Chinese Communist Party, they see, the outside is always in a state of war. So they're constantly in a state of war. They never exit, into times of peace. And that means you're always fighting for advantage. You're always fighting for, to gain an advantage over your opponent, and you're willing to do whatever means necessary. So that's kind of the overarching concept. But then the tools of that, if you go to a military officer in the United States and you say, how would you, use the tools of finance and trade and economics and influence to achieve your goals, they wouldn't even know what you're talking about. They wouldn't know how that you use business to achieve these outcomes. The really interesting thing about these two PLA colonels is that they were PLA Air Force officers. So they were like I used to be, a U.S. Air Force officer, except they understood the concept of how do you use finance as a weapon, how do you use trade as a weapon, how do you use, influence and psychological fear as a weapon. These are all things that they had witnessed and were creating doctrine for, where, in the West, military people, officers in particular, are not trained in this type of warfare. So it's a type of warfare that is completely alien to the way that we think of warfare. When we hear politics, we hear, okay, it's not time for us. It's when the politicians figure out what they want to do, then they call in the military. And in fact, Clausewitz and Jomini, who were early war theorists in the kind of Western tradition, they talked about, the general needed to get clear guidance from the politicians on what kind of objectives they needed to achieve. In the case of PLA's, concept of war, that is always part of it. Politics is part of war, and there is no separation between, going to war and the political system. It is all, constantly at war and constantly using politics as opposed to just kinetic means. Now, they're not immune to using force, and they talk about using force, and certainly they lay out in that document, Unrestricted Warfare, what are some lessons learned in the Gulf War, for example, and how they would do things differently. But that is a last resort. They want to use all means short of war first, because war is a risky endeavor.
How much does ideology affect the effects of unrestricted warfare?
Well, so this is something that the Chinese Communist Party understood after the Tiananmen massacre, and that is that, these ideas of democracy were finding their way into the Chinese people through these relationships that they were creating as they opened up the economy. And so they recognized that controlling the narrative and ideology was so important. In fact, Xi Jinping talks about document number 9, which is a document that demonstrates how important ideology is to the Chinese Communist Party, in particular calls out the U.S. Constitution and these ideas of democratic principles as being designed to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party. So one of the things that comes out of unrestricted warfare is this idea of dominating or controlling the narrative. And so ideology comes from the narrative. In other words, if you control what people say about a thing, then you control how they think about a thing. So in China, with the Great Firewall, they have complete and total control over the narrative. What they've been able to do is use proxies in the West to have the same control over the narrative in the West that they have within China. And this works for organizations like the National Basketball Association, where Daryl Morey was threatened with firing for, tweeting about Hong Kong. You see the same thing in corporate America, where, an employee of Marriott Corporation was fired for liking a tweet about Tibet. So they use their relationships in the West to, with proxies, to enable them to control the narrative. They did this very well with the coronavirus. So ideology, in terms of what is the narrative that the Chinese Communist Party wants to be the prevailing narrative globally, that's what they will work on. And it's not just their economic relationships with corporate America or the financial institutions of Wall Street. It's also through apps like TikTok that really reinforce messages that the Chinese Communist Party wants. It's by using bots on Twitter and other social media platforms. So it's comprehensive. It's using Hollywood to also spread messages that, promote the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. All elements of society are really imbued with this, Chinese Communist Party incessant need to control the narrative and therefore control ideology.
You spent a chapter on international order, and when I read that, I immediately thought about what the CCP had been doing when it was voting to either was kicking Russia out of the Security Council or so forth, with supporting Russia in the war. But there's more to this idea of China weaponizing international order.
Well, there is. And really what the Chinese Communist Party, these two PLA colonels wrote about was their recognition that the United States was using the United Nations, World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, all these different international institutions to promote the principles of democracy, which were in effect promoting the interests of the United States, which in a sense is true. The United States seeks to promote democratic principles, rule of law, civil liberties, human rights, because they believe that they are in the interests both of the United States and of the world writ large. But the Chinese Communist Party took that, idea of using international institutions to promote the interests of the United States and turn that around. And the way they turn that around is a couple of different ways. They influence the countries who are participating in organizations like the United Nations to join China in voting with them. They, China focused on ensuring that the people that were brought in to lead different organizations, for instance, like the World Health Organization, were people that they wanted to see and that they knew would be loyal to what China wanted to do and would promote China's, message and interests. So it has, they didn't want to destroy the international order. They wanted to take the international order as it was. Because, if you can take an international order and you can say, hey, this was designed to promote the principles of democracy and liberty and rule of law, and over time have that those institutions begin to promote authoritarianism or totalitarianism, they will then have the veneer of being committed to freedom, but in reality be supporting authoritarianism. So much better to support your authoritarian intentions through institutions that are ostensibly supposed to be promoting democracy. That's the most effective way to undermine the principles of democracy. You don't want to say, I am a dictatorship, or I am a dictator, or we are promoting dictatorial principles. That people would not rally to that. But if you can say, I'm promoting democracy, I'm promoting security and stability, economic prosperity, just listen to me. But in effect, you are denying civil liberties, you're denying human rights, you're denying economic prosperity for certain classes and individuals. Then you can, have the vision that you're, like she says, a shared, vision for humanity, but, in reality, be promoting, your own interests and authoritarian principles.
Speaking about COVID, you spend a lot of time in the book telling us that COVID was, in fact, part of the unrestricted warfare campaign. Looking now, 2 years later, what we're seeing in China, in Shanghai, and in Beijing and other cities, do you think that they succeeded in this campaign, or have they failed?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because I think in terms of, what they were trying to achieve with the coronavirus, what they wanted the world to believe is that the Chinese model the Chinese social, political, and economic model is superior to the democratic model. And in particular, they wanted to show that, look, China has done a better job at, protecting its population from the coronavirus. And they trot out these numbers of only, 4,600 or so people that have died due to the coronavirus. Of course, they stopped counting of it in April of 2020. So the idea here was to promote the Chinese model to nations around the world so that we could get them to, they could get those nations to adopt that model. Even, leaders of free societies like Justin Trudeau, raved about the Chinese model and how that's better. So I think, in terms of being effective at getting democracies around the world to accept the policies that mirror the Chinese Communist Party, because they had a more influential model. That's what they're talking about. That's how they essentially are able to say, hey, we have a better system than the democracy, and you should adopt and embrace this system. And I think, in many respects, the United States also embraced that. We embrace things like lockdowns, which originated in China, in Wuhan. They didn't originate in the West. They weren't even part of the CDC's or the World Health Organization's playbook. But they, shortly, the World Health Organization, the CDC, began to support these policies created in China and then essentially embraced in the West. So this is the power of unrestricted warfare.
How do you evaluate the Trump administration's China policies based on the ideas of unrestricted warfare?
Well, I think that what the Chinese Trump administration did in terms of China policy was bring the issue to light. I think it brought it to light in a way that it hadn't been looked at, in any Republican or Democratic administration since. And it did that in spite of the, extreme pushback from the corporate sector and the financial sector. I think, and many of those policies that came out of the Trump administration didn't go far enough. Yet a lot of them have been essentially brought in and embraced by the Biden administration. So what we're starting to see is Washington, D.C. begin to deal with the fact that China presents a different kind of challenge in terms of national security. The relationship with China impacts political independence and sovereignty in the United States. And yet it impacts it in a way that we're not really ready to compete with. So I would say that, the Trump administration, gets good marks for, bringing up the problem and really surfacing it. In terms of what the policy actually did to move the needle forward, I think it was much less follow through in that. I think the Biden administration has been slow to continue that follow through. And it's not slow because, the Trump administration or the Biden administration are either good or bad. What it is that our own political processes are influenced by the corporate sector and the financial sector, who in turn are influenced by the Chinese Communist Party. And this is not just in the United States. It's in democracies everywhere. Corporations, multinational corporations, particularly if they have business in China or want to sell products in China or have investments from China, they are required by the Chinese Communist Party to promote their own interests. And so when, say, for example, the U.S. government says we shouldn't have Huawei building, telecommunications infrastructure in our country, then you'll have the tech company in the United States come out, say, hey, we think we should have Huawei here because, China's putting pressure on them to do so. And so in many ways, when you look at how policy gets made in Washington, D.C., particularly with regard to national security or foreign policy, not understanding the implications of technology or other relationships that China brings into our society is a big problem and one that we have to reckon with. But we have no institution in the West that is tasked with understanding this form of warfare.
What do you think was the difference in the mindset of the 1999 People's Liberation Army versus the 1999 U.S. Military when it comes to what exactly was the position in the U.S.-China relationship?
Well, I read that in 1999, and first of all, I had never any expectation that the U.S. and China would have any type of conflict because, I didn't see China as a threat to the United States. I saw it as a partner that we could, work with and grow with. And, there was a fundamental belief at the time that, by integrating our economies, our societies, our political systems, and creating this bond with China that, over time, China would become more liberalized and would become freer, would become more like the United States. And when I further moved to China as an Olmsted scholar, all the business people that were in there, right after after China joined the WTO felt the same way. Like if we have business with China, they will become, more open, more politically liberalized. And of course, we've seen the exact opposite, particularly under Xi Jinping. So I think in many ways, being a military member in 1999 when this comes out, was very naive. I read the document. I believed that United States was most militarily powerful country on earth, and I was a part of that military. But in really understanding the full spectrum of war in terms of the way the Chinese Communist Party was thinking, I had no way of understanding that. In terms of perceiving, what they were saying, for me, it was so difficult for me to understand or grasp the concepts. Now, after, over 20 years from that document being produced, and you look back over the course of, the post-Cold War era, where, we have these authoritarian nations being brought into the international order and the impact that has had on the international order, I can see what they were writing about. And I'm much more clear-eyed in terms of, understanding what they were saying.
General, for yourself, when was the turning point that you realized things in the book were actually real things that they wanted to achieve in the Chinese military?
Well, before I went to be the defense attaché in China, I was a senior military fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. And at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, I met a lot of industry and business and finance leaders. I went from there to work for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. When I did that, we were dealing with the islands in the South China Sea. And, I got an email one day from a colleague that I had met in New York, and it really detailed a lot of the bad things that China was doing to our corporate sector. And it was at that point that I began to realize, okay, I didn't understand, unrestricted warfare. And I started to read much more about the Chinese Communist Party. That's when I started to read unrestricted warfare again. I started to study, and most people in the federal government have never studied what's going on in our corporate sector from a competitive standpoint. And that's when we really got to dig in and understand, okay, these things are going on across our society, across our academic system, across our economic and financial system. That's when, and I had a team of China experts working for me in the Pentagon, and we really started to study this program and interview corporate leaders, interview industry leaders, interview, the interagency folks that were working on China, and really began to understand that, the way we understand war was fundamentally at odds with, what we were seeing out there in terms of how it was actually being carried out by the Chinese Communist Party.
As the conclusion of the book, you offered many advices and ways to deal with China, but you also mentioned the measures of success on what is a successful strategy against China. Can you tell us a little bit more about that idea of measuring success against China?
Well, one of the outcomes of having this fulsome relationship with China is the degradation of our own economic opportunity for citizens in the United States. So many factories were picked up and taken to China lock, stock, and barrel. So many communities were destroyed. They were formerly communities where people worked in factories and had long-term steady jobs where they could, raise a family, own a home, really achieve what we talked about as the American dream. And so, by coupling ourselves to China, they raised 600 million people, out of poverty. Well, at the same time, they drove millions of Americans into, despair and really into an area where they didn't have hope. Then what followed was fentanyl. Fentanyl flooded, the streets of our small communities that had lost these jobs. So, what I talk about is, if we can decouple from China, if we can, get them out of our economic, political, academic, and financial systems and begin to reinvest in our own citizens, reinvest in infrastructure and manufacturing and science and technology and STEM education, you're going to start to see opportunities arise that haven't been there for decades in the United States. And so a lot of people feel this malaise or this sense that the country's going in the wrong direction. Well, the reason is because we have this very parasitic relationship with China. It pulls economic productivity out of the United States in order to perpetuate, the social contract within China, which is you give up your freedoms, we will provide security and economic prosperity for you, the party. And so in doing so, that economic prosperity that used to be, the birthright of Americans by living in a free society gets taken away. And it gets taken away with the active support of the corporate sector, who's making enormous profits by shipping that manufacturing over to China. And so I think as we separate and begin to reinvest in our own people, and as they begin to rise, they begin to inspire other nations around the world. Look at American citizens. They're doing well. They're prospering. They're reaching their own potential. And then they start to petition their own governments. I want that kind of system. Today, those citizens are looking to China and saying, that's a better system. I will do whatever you want if you just give me a job. This is the kind of thing that we have to combat, because it leads to a slippery slope where the Chinese Communist Party doesn't do this because they care about the Chinese people. They do it because they want control, they want power, and ultimately use that power to enrich themselves.
General Robert Spalding, thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion.
Thank you, David.